When a quiet, wealthy man returns to a small town decades after leaving as a destitute child, he seeks out the teacher who once fed him when no one else cared. But as he tries to repay her kindness, he uncovers secrets buried beneath years of silence about why he was abandoned, what happened to his family, and the real reason his teacher helped him that day. The tires of the sleek black sedan whispered against the cracked asphalt as it rolled into Elm Hollow, a town that seemed frozen in time. The car's polished exterior gleamed under the pale autumn sun, an incongruous sight among the weathered, clapboard houses and overgrown lawns. It had been 35 years since Daniel Marks last set foot here, a lifetime ago, and yet every street corner stirred faint echoes of memories he thought he'd buried. Daniel stepped out of the car, his tailored coat brushing against his knees as he surveyed the scene. The air carried a crisp edge, tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. He paused for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the town. Nothing much had changed. Even the old bakery on Main Street still stood, though its faded sign hung crookedly now. But Daniel wasn't here for nostalgia or sentimentality. His return was deliberate, calculated, like everything else about him. He slid his hands into his pockets and began walking toward the heart of Elm Hollow. The elementary school loomed ahead, its once vibrant brick facade now dulled by decades of neglect. Windows were boarded up, ivy crept along the walls, and the playground equipment, rusty swings and a tilting slide, looked like relics from another era. For a fleeting second, Daniel felt something stir deep within him, but he quickly pushed it aside. Sentimentality wouldn't serve him today. A few townsfolk noticed the stranger wandering near the school. They watched him curiously from their porches, murmuring to one another behind raised coffee mugs. To them, he was just another outsider passing through, perhaps someone scouting locations for a film or looking to buy cheap property. No one recognized him, not at first. "Can I help you?" came a voice behind him. Daniel turned to see a middle-aged man approaching, wearing oil-stained coveralls and holding a wrench. His name tag read Earl, and there was a wary kindness in his eyes. "I'm just visiting," Daniel replied smoothly, his tone measured but warm enough to disarm suspicion. "This place holds some memories for me." Earl scratched the back of his neck, squinting slightly. "You don't look familiar. You sure you're not mistaking this dump for somewhere else?" Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze drifting back to the dilapidated school. "No mistake. This is where I grew up, or at least part of it. I attended Elm Hollow Elementary." Earl let out a low whistle. "Well, ain't that something? Haven't seen many folks come back after leaving this town. Most can't wait to get out, truth be told." Daniel nodded absently, then added almost casually, "Do you happen to remember a teacher named Evelyn Harper? Mrs. Harper?" Earl froze mid-nod, his expression shifting from curiosity to something unreadable. For a long moment he simply stared at Daniel, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Then, clearing his throat, he said, "Yeah, I know who she was. Everyone round here does. What business do you have asking about her?" Daniel tilted his head, studying Earl carefully. "Just curious," he said, though his voice held an undertone of steel. "She made quite an impression on me when I was a boy." Earl shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. When he spoke again, his words carried a note of caution. "That woman, well, she ain't talked about much these days. Too many bad memories, you know. If you're planning on stirring up trouble, you might want to think twice." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the reaction. "Trouble? I assure you, I mean no harm. I only wanted to pay my respects." Earl didn't seem convinced, But before he could respond, a shrill voice cut through the air. "Who are you? And what do you want with Evelyn Harper?" Both men turned to see an elderly woman standing a few feet away, leaning heavily on a cane. Her sharp blue eyes bored into Daniel, filled with equal parts suspicion and defiance. She wore a faded floral dress and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, but her presence commanded attention. Daniel offered a polite smile. "Ma'am, my name is Daniel Marks, and I'm afraid I haven't had the pleasure." "You're lying," she interrupted sharply. Her grip tightened on the cane, knuckles whitening. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. You're one of hers, aren't you? One of Evelyn's boys." For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of unease. How could she possibly know? He schooled his features into calm indifference, but inside his mind raced. "I'm sorry," he said evenly, "but I don't understand what you mean." The woman took a step closer, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "Don't play games with me, son. That school, that woman, they left marks on people that don't fade, no matter how far they run. Now, tell me why you're really here." Daniel hesitated, weighing his options. Whatever secrets this town held, they ran deeper than he'd anticipated. And Evelyn Harper's name clearly carried weight. Weight he hadn't expected. I'll answer your questions," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. "But first, I need to speak with Mrs. Harper." The woman snorted, shaking her head. "Good luck with that. She hasn't been seen outside her house in years. Folks say she's lost her mind. Maybe you should ask yourself whether poking around in the past is worth it." With that, she turned and shuffled away, leaving Daniel standing in uneasy silence. Earl gave him one last wary glance before heading back to his work, muttering something under his breath about outsiders stirring up ghosts. As Daniel looked back at the decaying school, he couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would uncover more than he bargained for. Whatever secrets lay buried in Elm Hollow, they weren't staying hidden anymore, and Evelyn Harper was the key to unlocking them all. The memory surfaced unbidden, as vivid and raw as if it had happened yesterday. Daniel stood at the edge of the crumbling schoolyard, his fingers brushing against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree. He closed his eyes, letting the past wash over him in waves of shame, gratitude, and something he couldn't quite name. Elm Hollow, Elementary School, Spring, 1989. Daniel Marks was 10 years old, though he looked younger. Thin limbs, hollow cheeks, and clothes that hung loosely on his small frame. His father's drinking binges had become more frequent, their meager pantry emptier with each passing week. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, a relentless ache that made focusing on anything else nearly impossible. That day, the cafeteria smelled like heaven, or at least what Daniel imagined heaven might smell like. Warm bread, buttery mashed potatoes, and something sweet for dessert. The other kids laughed and chattered as they lined up for lunch, their trays filling with food that seemed impossibly abundant to Daniel's starving eyes. He lingered by the doorway, trying not to be noticed but unable to tear himself away. When most of the students had filed out, he slipped inside, heart pounding. No one would miss one sandwich, he told himself. Just one. His hands trembled as he reached for the half-eaten peanut butter and jelly sandwich left behind on a tray. But before his fingers could close around it, a gentle voice stopped him cold. "Daniel." He froze, panic surging through him. Slowly, he turned to see Mrs. Evelyn Harper standing there, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her glasses perched delicately on her nose. She didn't look angry, just observant. I wasn't going to take it," Daniel stammered, clutching the stolen sandwich behind his back. "I swear." Mrs. Harper stepped closer, crouching down so she was eye level with him. There was no judgment in her gaze, only quiet understanding. "Are you hungry, Daniel?" His throat tightened, and he nodded barely enough for her to notice. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away fiercely. Crying meant weakness, and weakness meant ridicule. At home, at school, everywhere. Without another word, Mrs. Harper rose and walked to the serving counter. She returned moments later holding a fresh plate, a turkey sandwich, carrot sticks, and a chocolate chip cookie. She handed it to him without ceremony, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Eat," she said simply. "There's plenty." Daniel hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was watching. Then, unable to resist any longer, he sank onto a nearby bench and began eating ravenously. Each bite felt like salvation, warming him from the inside out. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, his stomach didn't feel empty. When he finished, Mrs. Harper sat beside him, holding her hands neatly in her lap. "You don't have to be ashamed of being hungry, Daniel," she said softly. "Everyone needs help sometimes. What matters is how we treat others when they need us." Daniel stared at his feet, too overwhelmed to respond. He wanted to thank her, to say something meaningful, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded again, hoping she'd understand. Before she left, Mrs. Harper pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. "Read this later, okay? And remember, you matter more than you know." Confused but curious, Daniel tucked the note into his pocket and watched her walk away. Later, that evening, alone in his room while his father slept off another drunken stupor, he unfolded the paper. Written in neat, looping script were the same words she'd spoken. "You matter more than you know." Something shifted inside him that night. Those simple words became a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, someone believed in him. Someone saw value in him when he couldn't see it himself. Present day. Daniel opened his eyes, pulling himself back to the present. The oak tree still stood where it always had, its branches stretching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The school behind him was quieter now, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet the weight of Mrs. Harper's kindness lingered, heavy and undeniable. He wondered if she remembered that day. Did she know the impact those few minutes had on a scared, hungry boy? Did she realize she'd planted a seed of hope in soil that should have been barren? A bitter wind swept through the schoolyard, carrying with it the faint scent of damp leaves and decay. Daniel shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, his jaw tightening. Whatever secrets Elm Hollow held, and whatever role Evelyn Harper played in them, he owed it to her to uncover the truth. And perhaps in doing so he could repay the debt he'd carried for 35 years. The address Daniel had scrawled onto a scrap of paper led him to the edge of Elm Hollow, where the town faded into dense woods and winding dirt roads. The house was easy to spot, not because it stood out, but because it seemed to retreat into itself, as if trying to disappear entirely. Its white paint was peeling, its shutters hung askew, and the porch sagged under the weight of years gone by. Overgrown bushes clawed at the front steps, and the mailbox leaned drunkenly on its post. Daniel parked his car along the shoulder of the narrow road and stepped out, his shoes crunching against gravel. For a moment he simply stared at the house, searching for any sign of life. There was none. No light flickered in the windows, no smoke curled from the chimney. It looked abandoned, haunted even, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-forgotten dream. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves covering the ground. Up close, the neglect was even more apparent. A for sale sign tilted precariously in the overgrown yard. Its lettering faded almost beyond recognition. Whoever had listed the property clearly hadn't bothered following up. Weeds now claimed what little lawn remained, and ivy crept steadily up the walls. Knocking on the door felt futile, but Daniel did it anyway, rapping sharply with his knuckles. The sound echoed hollowly through the empty house, unanswered. He tried the handle. It turned easily, the lock long since broken or ignored. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of mildew. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light filtering through cracked blinds. The furniture was sparse. An old armchair draped with a moth-eaten blanket, a small wooden table stacked with yellowed newspapers, and a single lamp missing its shade. On the far wall, a calendar hung frozen on December of 5 years ago, its pages curling at the edges. Daniel wandered further into the house, his footsteps creaking on warped floorboards. Each room told fragments of a story left unfinished. In the kitchen, dishes still sat in the sink, coated with grime. A teacup rested upside down on the counter, as though waiting to be dried. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, blankets rumpled as if someone had risen abruptly and never returned. It wasn't just abandonment. It was departure. Someone had left this house in haste, leaving everything behind except whatever they could carry. And based on the whispers he'd heard earlier, that someone was Evelyn Harper. Stepping back outside, Daniel noticed movement next door. A woman in her 60s stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her wary gaze followed him as he approached. "Looking for Evelyn?" she asked before he could speak. Her tone was clipped, tinged with suspicion. "Yes," Daniel replied, keeping his voice calm and polite. "Do you know where she is?" The woman shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No one does. She disappeared one winter night 5 years ago. Just vanished. Folks said she'd been acting strange for months before that, keeping to herself, pulling away from everyone. Then one day, poof, gone." Daniel frowned, glancing back at the decrepit house. "Did anyone report her missing? File a police report?" The neighbor let out a humorless laugh. "Not around here. People don't meddle much in each other's business anymore. Besides..." She hesitated, looking away as though debating whether to say more. "Besides what?" Daniel pressed gently. Her eyes met his again, sharp and calculating. "There were rumors. About her. About things that happened back when she taught at the school. Some folks thought maybe she finally snapped, decided to leave all that behind. Others?" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Well, I reckon you'll hear plenty of stories if you stick around long enough." Daniel nodded slowly, sensing she wouldn't or couldn't elaborate further. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "If you think of anything else, please let me know." She gave him a curt nod, but didn't respond, retreating into her house as soon as he turned away. As the screen door slammed shut behind her, Daniel exhaled deeply, his mind racing. Whatever had driven Evelyn Harper to abandon her home, and possibly the town itself, it wasn't something ordinary. This wasn't simply a case of someone choosing solitude. Something darker lurked beneath the surface. Back at his car, Daniel paused, staring once more at the empty house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note he'd carried with him all these years. "You matter more than you know." Those words had guided him through some of the hardest moments of his life, anchoring him when he felt adrift. Now, standing here amid the ruins of Evelyn's world, they took on new meaning. Whoever she was, whatever secrets she held, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Finding her wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about understanding the ripple effects of kindness and how far they could reach. As he climbed into his car and drove away, he resolved to dig deeper. If Evelyn Harper had fled Elm Hollow, there had to be clues somewhere, a trail leading to answers, and Daniel intended to follow it, no matter where it took him. The next morning, Daniel returned to Evelyn Harper's house with Claire Whitaker, a local woman who had agreed, for a modest fee, to help him sift through the remnants of Evelyn's life. Claire was in her mid-50s, wiry and practical, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She wore an old flannel shirt tucked into jeans, and her hands were calloused from years of hard work. Though she didn't say much as they climbed the creaking stairs together, Daniel sensed her curiosity and perhaps a hint of unease. "This place gives me the creeps," Claire admitted finally, glancing around at the peeling wallpaper and cobwebbed corners. "I heard stories about Evelyn when I was growing up. Folks said she could see things other people couldn't. Weird stuff." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He'd learned long ago that small towns thrived on whispers and half-truths. Separating fact from fiction often proved futile. Instead, he focused on the task ahead. The attic door loomed before them, its surface warped and splintered. With some effort, Daniel pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward into shadow. Claire hesitated at the threshold, gripping the railing tightly. "You sure about this? Feels like we're trespassing on something private." "We are," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "But if there are answers here, I need to find them." She sighed, muttering under her breath, but followed him nonetheless. The attic smelled of damp wood and forgotten time. Dust motes swirled lazily in the dim light, filtering through a single grimy window. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, stacked haphazardly alongside trunks and crates. It was clear no one had touched these items in years. "Where do we start?" Claire asked, brushing stray strands of gray-streaked hair from her face. "Everywhere," Daniel replied, already moving toward the nearest stack of boxes. "Look for anything personal. Letters, photos, journals, anything that might tell us where she went, or why." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the occasional groan of the floorboards beneath their weight. Claire hummed softly to herself, clearly trying to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Daniel, however, remained focused, his movements methodical as he opened box after box filled with faded textbooks, mismatched china, and bundles of fabric tied with brittle ribbon. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that he found it. A plain cardboard box shoved into a far corner, almost hidden behind a broken rocking chair. What caught his attention wasn't its appearance. It was the label scrawled across the top in neat, looping handwriting. For Daniel. His breath hitched. For a moment he simply stared at the box, his pulse quickening. Then, with trembling fingers, he pulled it free and carried it to the center of the attic. Claire stopped what she was doing and watched curiously as he knelt beside it. "You know her?" Claire asked, her voice soft. He nodded, though he didn't elaborate. Lifting the lid, he peered inside. At first glance, the contents seemed ordinary enough. A few photographs, a child's drawing, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. But as he began sorting through them, each item struck him with the force of memory rekindled. The first photograph showed a younger Evelyn Harper standing outside the school, her arms wrapped protectively around a group of children. Daniel recognized himself immediately, the smallest boy in the front row, gazing up at her with wide, trusting eyes. Another picture depicted the same classroom, desks arranged neatly in rows, sunlight streaming through the windows. He remembered, how safe that room had felt, even when the world beyond its walls was anything but. Beneath the photos lay the drawing. A simple sunflower sketched in crayon, vibrant yellow petals radiating outward. In the corner, written in childish block letters, were the words, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper." Daniel swallowed hard, recalling the day he'd made it. It had been his way of saying thank you for all those lunches, and for believing in him when no one else did. But it was the letter that left him shaken. It sat at the bottom of the box, sealed in an envelope addressed to him but never mailed. His name was written on the front in Evelyn's familiar script, the ink slightly smudged as though her hand had trembled while writing it. With great care, Daniel broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. The words blurred momentarily as tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away, forcing himself to read. "Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, then I've failed you, and myself, in ways I can scarcely bear to admit. There are truths I should have told you long ago, burdens I should have shared instead of carrying alone. But fear kept me silent, and pride kept me distant. Do you remember the day you took the sandwich? That moment changed both our lives, though neither of us realized it then. You reminded me of why I became a teacher, not just to educate but to nurture hope in places where it seems lost. And yet, over the years, I let despair creep in. I let others dictate my choices, silencing the very compassion I once cherished. I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. All I can offer is this confession. The kindness you received from me came not out of obligation, but because I saw something extraordinary in you. Something resilient, something good. Please don't let anyone take that away from you, not even yourself. Wherever I am now, know that you are remembered. Always. Yours, Evelyn." Daniel lowered the letter, his hands trembling. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and comforting all at once. He hadn't expected gratitude or regret. He'd come seeking answers, not absolution. Yet, here it was, raw and unfiltered, staring back at him from the page. "What does it say?" Claire asked quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel shook his head, folding the letter carefully and tucking it back into the envelope. "It's personal," he murmured. "But it tells me one thing for certain. Whatever happened to Evelyn Harper, it wasn't random. She chose to leave because she thought she had no other choice." Claire frowned, crossing her arms. Sounds like she blamed herself for something. Maybe whatever drove her away wasn't her fault at all. "Maybe," Daniel conceded, though doubt lingered in his voice. "But I won't know unless I keep looking." As they packed up the box and prepared to leave, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn had left this treasure trove intentionally, for him to find. Whether it was meant as closure or a clue, he didn't yet know. But one thing was clear. Uncovering the truth about Evelyn Harper would require delving deeper into the shadows of Elm Hollow than he'd anticipated. And Daniel Marks wasn't afraid of the dark. That night, Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit room of his rented cabin on the outskirts of Elm Hollow. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. On the table before him lay Evelyn Harper's letter, its edges worn from being handled too many times. He'd read it over and over, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness like a stone dropped into still water. But there was one sentence he kept returning to, a single line that had sent a chill down his spine. "I promised your mother something shortly before she died, and I've carried that promise, and my silence, ever since." Daniel stared at the words, his mind racing. His mother's death had always been shrouded in mystery. Officially, it was ruled an accident, a fall down the stairs during one of his father's drunken rages. But Daniel had never fully believed that explanation. As a child, he'd clung to fragments of memory. Muffled arguments late at night, the sound of breaking glass, the way his mother would sometimes look at him with eyes filled with both love and sorrow, as if she knew something he didn't. Now, Evelyn's words suggested there was more to the story. Something darker, more deliberate. Someone had caused his mother's death, and Evelyn had known, or at least suspected, but hadn't spoken up. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper as anger surged within him. Why hadn't she said anything? What could possibly have been so terrifying that she chose silence over justice? The rest of the letter offered little clarity, only vague hints. Your mother trusted me, Daniel. She came to me in confidence because she feared for her life and for yours. I failed her when I didn't act. I failed you when I let fear dictate my choices. If you're reading this, know that the truth matters more than you realize. Find it. Face it. Only then can we hope to make amends. Amends. The word echoed in Daniel's mind, hollow and heavy. Amends for what? For failing to protect his mother? For letting her die alone, betrayed even in death? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as exhaustion and frustration warred within him. This wasn't just about finding Evelyn anymore. It was about unraveling a web of secrets that stretched back decades. A web he hadn't even known existed until now. The next morning, Daniel returned to town, determined to piece together what Evelyn might have meant. He started at the library, where rows of dusty archives lined the walls. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, greeted him with a cautious smile. Looking for something specific? She asked, adjusting her glasses. I need old newspapers, Daniel replied. From the late 80s, specifically anything related to accidents or deaths in Elm Hollow. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window as though weighing whether to indulge him. Finally, she nodded and led him to a corner of the library where microfilm machines hummed quietly. It took hours of scrolling through grainy headlines and faded photographs, but eventually Daniel found it. A brief article buried deep in the local section. The headline read, Local Woman Dies in Tragic Accident. Beneath it was a small black and white photo of his mother, smiling faintly despite the poor quality of the image. The article itself was sparse, offering few details beyond the official narrative. Sarah Marks, 32, passed away after falling down the stairs at her home. Her husband, James Marks, discovered her body and called authorities. No foul play was suspected. But as Daniel studied the text, one name caught his eye. A witness quoted in the article, Evelyn Harper listed as a family friend. His breath caught. Evelyn hadn't just known his mother, she'd been there when it happened. She'd seen the aftermath firsthand, and yet, she'd stayed silent. Fury bubbled beneath the surface, but Daniel forced himself to remain calm. There had to be more. People didn't keep quiet about things like this without reason. Before leaving the library, he approached Margaret again. Do you remember Evelyn Harper? He asked casually. Her expression softened, tinged with nostalgia. Of course. She taught here for years. Everyone loved her. Well, almost everyone. She paused, lowering her voice conspiratorially. There were rumors, you know, about her getting involved in things she shouldn't have. Some said she meddled too much in other people's lives. Others claimed she knew things. Dangerous things. Dangerous how? Daniel pressed. Margaret shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know the specifics, but I do remember hearing whispers about trouble at the school back then. Teachers arguing, parents complaining, and Evelyn. She seemed different after that. Quieter, almost like she was carrying some kind of burden. Daniel thanked her and left the library, his thoughts swirling. Whatever Evelyn had promised his mother, it had cost her dearly. It had driven her into seclusion, made her afraid to speak out, even to him. As he walked through the quiet streets of Elm Hollow, Daniel realized the truth wouldn't come easily. This town held secrets, layered like sediment, hidden beneath years of denial and fear. But he also knew one thing for certain. Evelyn Harper hadn't fled because she wanted to escape. She'd run because someone, or something, had given her no other choice. And Daniel intended to find out who. The next day, Daniel paid a visit to the Elm Hollow School District office, a squat brick building tucked behind the newer high school. The receptionist, a young woman with an overly bright smile, eyed him warily when he explained his request. "I'm trying to track down some records related to Evelyn Harper," Daniel said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "She taught at Elm Hollow Elementary for many years." The receptionist hesitated, tapping her pen against the desk. "Personnel files are confidential, sir, unless you have authorization." "I understand," Daniel interrupted smoothly, sliding a business card across the counter. His philanthropic work often required navigating bureaucratic red tape, and he knew how to play the part. "I'm conducting research for a charitable project honoring former educators. I assure you, this is purely informational." After a moment's deliberation, and perhaps swayed by the impressive title on his card, the receptionist disappeared into the back room. Minutes later, she returned with a thin manila folder marked Evelyn Harper in faded black ink. "Thank you," Daniel said, offering her a grateful smile. He carried the folder to a nearby table and began flipping through its contents. At first glance, it seemed disappointingly sparse. A few memos, performance evaluations, and letters of commendation. But as he reached the final pages, something caught his eye. A folded document tucked loosely between two sheets of stationery. Unfolding it carefully, Daniel recognized the format immediately. A police report dated October 1989. His heart quickened as he scanned the details. The report described an anonymous tip alleging suspicious activity at Elm Hollow Elementary involving staff members. No names were mentioned, but the timing coincided eerily with his mother's death. Tucked inside the same section of the file was a plain white envelope, slightly yellowed with age. Written on the front in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting was a single name: George Langley. Daniel frowned, unfamiliar with the name. Flipping the envelope over, he found a brief note scrawled on the back. "He knows more than he says. Speak to him if you dare." A retired janitor. What could a janitor possibly know about his mother's death, or Evelyn's cryptic warning? Back at his car, Daniel pulled out his phone and began searching. It didn't take long to find George Langley listed in public records as a resident of Pine Ridge Care Home, located just outside Elm Hollow. According to the facility's website, George had worked for the school district for over 3 decades before retiring in the early 2000s. As Daniel drove toward Pine Ridge, his mind churned with questions. Why would Evelyn leave evidence pointing to a janitor? Had George witnessed something during those fateful months? Or was he involved in ways Daniel couldn't yet imagine? Pine Ridge Care Home smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Its halls lined with cheerful paintings and bulletin boards adorned with resident artwork. A nurse greeted Daniel warmly and escorted him to a small common area where George Langley sat alone, staring out the window. George looked older than Daniel expected, his face lined with wrinkles and his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Despite his frailty, there was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested intelligence, and perhaps caution. "Mr. Langley?" Daniel asked gently, pulling up a chair beside him. "My name is Daniel Marks. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." George turned slowly, studying Daniel with narrowed eyes. "Marks? That name sounds familiar." "It should," Daniel replied evenly. "My mother, Sarah Marks, passed away in 1989. You worked at Elm Hollow Elementary around that time." Recognition flickered in George's expression, followed by something darker, unease, maybe even guilt. "Ah, yes," he muttered, looking away. "Tragic business." "I'm not here to dwell on tragedy," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. "But I am here because I believe you might know something about what happened. Something Evelyn Harper trusted you with." At the mention of Evelyn's name, George stiffened visibly. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "Evelyn always did have a way of seeing too much. Trouble was, she didn't always know when to stop asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Daniel pressed. George hesitated, glancing around as though ensuring they were truly alone. When he finally spoke, his words came haltingly, weighed down by years of silence. "There were things going on at that school. Things most folks didn't want to talk about. Teachers arguing, parents upset, money missing from fundraisers, supplies disappearing without explanation. And then there were the accusations. Whispers about certain staff members taking advantage of their positions. Your mother, she got caught in the middle of all that." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, caught in the middle?" George sighed heavily, running a shaky hand through his thinning hair. "She came to me one night, scared out of her wits. Said she'd overheard something. A conversation between two people who shouldn't have been talking. She wouldn't tell me exactly what it was, but she made me promise to keep an eye on you. Said if anything happened to her, I needed to make sure you were safe." "And did you?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "I tried," George admitted, his shoulders sagging under the weight of regret. "But after she died, everything went quiet. Too quiet. Folks stopped asking questions, stopped caring. Even Evelyn. She backed off, kept to herself. Whatever your mother uncovered, it scared everyone into silence, including me." Daniel clenched his fists, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Do you know who those people were? The ones my mother overheard?" George shook his head, though his expression suggested otherwise. "All I can tell you is this. Whoever they were, they had power. Enough to make sure no one ever spoke up again." For a long moment, Daniel sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of George's words. His mother hadn't simply stumbled upon danger. She'd uncovered corruption. Secrets protected by fear and influence. And now, 35 years later, those secrets still cast a shadow over Elm Hollow. "Thank you," Daniel said finally, rising to his feet. "You've given me more than anyone else has dared." George nodded solemnly, his gaze drifting back to the window. As Daniel walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's story was incomplete, that there were pieces of the puzzle George still refused to share. But one thing was clear. The closer Daniel got to the truth, the deeper the web of lies became, and unraveling it would require confronting forces far greater than he'd anticipated. The weight of George Langley's words lingered with Daniel long after he left Pine Ridge Care Home. The old janitor's fragmented confession had only deepened the mystery, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. But one thing was undeniable. His mother hadn't died in an accident. or at least not the kind everyone believed. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel returned to the care home under the guise of checking on George's well-being. He knew time was slipping away. George's dementia made him unreliable, and Daniel couldn't risk losing the thread of truth buried beneath years of silence. When he arrived, the nurse on duty greeted him with a sympathetic smile. "He's been restless tonight," she said softly, "talking about things that don't make sense. You can try talking to him again if you'd like." Daniel nodded his thanks and followed her down the dimly lit hallway to George's room. Inside, the elderly man sat slumped in a chair by the window, staring blankly at the moonlit sky. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on his lap, and his breathing came slow and uneven. "George?" Daniel said gently, pulling up another chair beside him. "It's me, Daniel Marks. We spoke earlier today, remember?" For a moment, there was no response. Then George blinked slowly, his clouded eyes focusing on Daniel's face. "Marks, yes, I know that name." His voice was softer now, tinged with confusion. "You're the boy from the school, the one Evelyn looked after." "That's right," Daniel encouraged, leaning closer. "You told me my mother overheard something dangerous. Do you remember what it was?" George frowned, shaking his head faintly. Too many voices, too much noise. Hard to tell what's real anymore. "It's okay," Daniel reassured him, keeping his tone calm. "Just tell me what you can. Please, you're the only one who knows." George stared at him for a long moment, his gaze searching Daniel's face as though trying to piece together fragmented memories. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She found out," he muttered, his words disjointed but urgent. "Your mother, she saw them in the basement. They didn't think anyone would hear, but she did. She tried to stop them, tried to protect you." His voice trailed off, replaced by a shaky sigh. "Stop who, George?" Daniel pressed, his heart pounding. "Who was in the basement?" "The ones pulling the strings," George replied cryptically, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Powerful men. Men who could ruin lives with a word. Your mother confronted them. They didn't like that. Didn't like it at all." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "What happened to her after that?" George's expression darkened, his trembling hands clutching tighter. "She didn't die in a fire," he whispered hoarsely. "That's what they wanted everyone to believe. But she disappeared, just gone. No body, no proof, only rumors." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. All these years, he'd mourned her death, accepted the official story without question, and yet, somewhere deep inside, he'd always suspected it wasn't the whole truth. Now, hearing it confirmed, or at least implied, was both devastating and infuriating. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. "Why didn't you say anything?" George's eyes filled with tears, his frail frame sagging further into the chair. "Because we were scared," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Scared of what they'd do to us if we spoke up. Scared of losing everything. Evelyn. She stayed close to you because she promised your mother she would. She thought maybe, just maybe, she could keep you safe." The enormity of Evelyn's sacrifice hit Daniel like a tidal wave. For decades, she'd carried the burden of silence, not just for herself, but for him. She'd watched over him, protected him, even when he had no idea how much danger he might have been in. "And now?" Daniel asked quietly. "Do you know where those men are? The ones responsible?" George shook his head weakly, his gaze drifting toward the window again. Names fade, faces blur, but their shadows still linger. You'll find them if you dig deep enough. Just be careful, son. They're not the kind of people who forget or forgive. As George's voice trailed off into silence, Daniel sat back, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, forming a picture darker and more sinister than he'd imagined. His mother hadn't simply stumbled upon corruption. She'd uncovered a conspiracy powerful enough to erase her entirely. And now, 35 years later, Daniel was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The morning after his conversation with George, Daniel sat at the library once again, surrounded by stacks of microfilm reels and yellowed newspapers. His hands moved mechanically as he scrolled through decades-old headlines, searching for anything that might connect his mother's disappearance to the powerful men George had hinted at. The janitor's warnings echoed in his mind. Powerful men. Shadows still linger. It wasn't until late afternoon that he found it. A small article buried deep within the local section of the Elm Hollow Gazette, dated January 1990. The headline read, "Fire Destroys Abandoned Warehouse on Outskirts of Town." Daniel leaned closer, his pulse quickening as he scanned the text. According to the report, the fire had broken out in an old industrial building long abandoned by its owner. Firefighters arrived too late. The structure was completely gutted. No injuries were reported, but investigators noted signs of arson, though no suspects were identified. What caught Daniel's attention most, however, was the name listed as the property owner, William Loring, then mayor of Elm Hollow. His stomach churned as he stared at the name, tracing the letters with his finger as if committing them to memory. William Loring had been a prominent figure in Elm Hollow during the late 80s and early 90s. A charismatic politician known for his ambitious development projects and promises of revitalizing the struggling town. But according to whispers Daniel vaguely remembered from childhood, Loring's tenure had ended abruptly amid scandal. He'd left Elm Hollow shortly thereafter, disappearing from public life entirely. Could this warehouse fire have been connected to his mother's disappearance? Had her confrontation with powerful men led her straight into their trap? Daniel copied down the details of the article and headed back to the archives, this time searching for anything related to William Loring. It didn't take long to uncover more troubling information. In addition to his role as mayor, Loring had served as chairman of several influential committees, including one overseeing school district funding and operations. This meant he would have interacted regularly with teachers, administrators, and possibly even parents like Sarah Marks. One particular document stood out, a transcript of a town hall meeting held in November 1989, just weeks after his mother's supposed death. Residents raised concerns about mismanagement of funds and allegations of corruption within the school board. Though names weren't explicitly mentioned, Daniel noticed repeated references to outside influences meddling in local affairs. At the center of the controversy, none other than Mayor Loring himself. As Daniel pieced together these fragments, a chilling theory began to form. What if his mother hadn't merely overheard something incriminating? What if she'd uncovered evidence linking Loring and others to illegal activities? Activities they couldn't afford to let anyone expose? He needed proof. Something concrete to tie Loring to the fire, and potentially to his mother's fate. That evening, Daniel visited Margaret, the elderly librarian who had helped him before. She greeted him warmly, but seemed surprised when he asked about William Loring. "Loring?" she repeated, her expression tightening slightly. "Now, there's a name I haven't heard in years." "I'm looking into some old news stories," Daniel explained carefully. "Specifically the warehouse fire in 1990. Do you happen to know what happened to Loring after he left office?" Margaret hesitated, glancing around as though ensuring they were alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and measured. "People talked, of course," she said. "After everything went south, the scandals, the accusations, he packed up and moved away. Some say he fled to avoid prosecution. Others claim he retired quietly somewhere far from here. Either way, no one's seen or heard from him since." "But surely someone must have kept tabs on him," Daniel pressed. "A man like that doesn't just vanish without leaving a trail." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "There is one person who might know more. Harold Finch. He used to work as Loring's assistant back in the day. If anyone has dirt on him, it's Harold." Daniel thanked her and quickly located Harold Finch's address, a modest house near the edge of town. As he approached the front door, he felt a flicker of unease. Was he stepping too close to dangerous ground? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside. He was already in too deep to turn back now. Harold answered the door cautiously, his wiry frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. He squinted at Daniel, clearly wary of unexpected visitors. After introducing himself and explaining his interest in Loring, Daniel watched as recognition dawned in Harold's eyes. "You're wasting your time," Harold muttered, shaking his head. "Whatever you think you'll find, trust me, it's better left buried." "Maybe," Daniel replied evenly, "but my mother's gone, and I need to know why. If Loring had anything to do with it, I deserve the truth." Harold studied him for a long moment, his weathered face betraying a mix of reluctance and pity. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, motioning for Daniel to come in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mothballs and stale coffee. Harold gestured for Daniel to sit, then retrieved a dusty photo album from a nearby shelf. Flipping it open, he pointed to a faded picture of William Loring standing beside a group of men outside the burned remains of the warehouse. "That fire was no accident," Harold admitted grimly. "And your mother, well, let's just say she wasn't the first person to get caught in Loring's crosshairs." Daniel's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Harold leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Rumors circulated for years about Loring using his position to cover up crimes. Embezzlement, blackmail, worse. Anyone who got too close disappeared. Your mother must have stumbled onto something big enough to make him panic." "So where is he now?" Daniel demanded, his fists clenched tightly. Harold shrugged helplessly. "Last I heard, he settled somewhere out west, Montana, maybe Wyoming. Changed his name, tried to start fresh. But believe me, if you go looking for him, you're playing with fire." As Daniel left Harold's house, the weight of the older man's warning settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. Not when the answers were finally within reach. For the first time in 35 years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could uncover the truth, not just for himself, but for his mother, and perhaps in doing so bring justice to a town that had long remained silent. The next morning, Daniel sat in his cabin, poring over the information he'd gathered about William Loring. His search had confirmed what Harold Finch had hinted at. William was dead, having passed away nearly a decade earlier under unremarkable circumstances. But there was one name that kept surfacing in connection to him: his son, Jacob Loring. Jacob had inherited more than just his father's legacy. He now ran the Elm Hollow Redevelopment Agency, a powerful organization tasked with revitalizing the town's crumbling infrastructure. To the outside world, Jacob was a model citizen, a successful businessman and philanthropist dedicated to breathing new life into Elm Hollow. but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob's polished exterior hid something darker, something inherited from his father. With renewed determination, Daniel arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing potential charitable investments in the town. He knew approaching Jacob directly about the past would be risky, but he needed to gauge the man's reaction firsthand. If Jacob was involved, or even aware of his father's secrets, he might slip up. The office of the Elm Hollow Redevelopment Agency was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the rest of the town. Glass walls reflected the pale sunlight, and minimalist furniture lined the waiting area. A young receptionist greeted Daniel with a practiced smile and led him to Jacob's private office. Jacob Loring rose from behind his desk as Daniel entered, extending a hand with an easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess everything they landed on. His tailored suit spoke of wealth and power, but there was a tension in his posture, an almost imperceptible stiffness that suggested he wasn't entirely at ease. "Mr. Marks," Jacob said smoothly, gesturing for Daniel to take a seat. "I understand you're interested in supporting some of our projects here in Elm Hollow." "That's right," Daniel replied, matching Jacob's tone. "But before we dive into specifics, I wanted to ask about your vision for the town. You've accomplished quite a bit since taking over from your father." At the mention of William Loring, Jacob's expression shifted ever so slightly. His smile tightened, and his gaze hardened. "My father laid the groundwork, but times have changed. We're focused on progress now." "Progress is important," Daniel agreed, leaning back in his chair. "Though sometimes it helps to understand where we came from. For instance, I read about the fire at that old warehouse back in '90. Tragic event. Do you remember much about it?" Jacob's jaw clenched, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice cooler than before. "That was a long time ago. Honestly, I don't recall many details. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Daniel said lightly, though his eyes never left Jacob's face. "Just curious. It seems like such a pivotal moment for the town, especially given the rumors about corruption during your father's administration." Jacob's composure faltered for the briefest second, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive laugh. "Rumors are cheap, Mr. Marks. My father did great things for this town, despite what certain people might say. If you're looking for scandal, you won't find it here." "I'm not looking for scandal," Daniel countered calmly. "Just clarity. There were whispers about mismanaged funds, illegal dealings, even accusations involving the school district. Did your father ever address those claims?" Jacob's patience visibly wore thin. He stood abruptly, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Look, Mr. Marks, I appreciate your interest in Elm Hollow, but dredging up ancient history isn't productive. Let's focus on the future, shall we? If you're serious about investing, I can provide you with all the materials you need." Daniel nodded, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. Rising to his feet, he offered a polite smile. "Of course. Thank you for your time, Mr. Loring." As he walked out of the office, Daniel couldn't ignore the nagging certainty that Jacob knew far more than he let on, and that his defensiveness wasn't just about protecting his father's reputation. Whatever skeletons lurked in the Loring family closet, Jacob was determined to keep them buried. That night, Daniel returned to his cabin, exhausted but alert. He parked his car in the narrow driveway and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. On the kitchen table lay Evelyn Harper's box, the one containing her letter, the photographs, and the drawing she'd kept for him all these years. It felt like a lifeline, proof that someone had cared enough to preserve fragments of his past. But when Daniel went to retrieve it the following morning, his blood ran cold. The box was gone. Panic surged through him as he searched every corner of the cabin, though deep down he already knew what had happened. Someone had broken in while he slept. The window near the back door stood slightly ajar, its lock jimmied open. Footsteps in the dirt outside confirmed the intruder's escape route. His car, too, bore signs of tampering. The passenger side window was smashed, shards of glass scattered across the seat. Nothing else appeared to be missing. Just the box. Daniel clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. Whoever had taken it wasn't just stealing evidence, they were sending a message. And judging by Jacob Loring's reaction during their meeting, Daniel had a strong suspicion who was behind it. As he stared at the empty space where the box had been, a grim resolve settled over him. They could take the physical items, but they couldn't erase the memories, or the truths they represented. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. Find it. Face it. And Daniel intended to do exactly that. The loss of the box gnawed at Daniel like an open wound. Its contents had been his anchor, a tangible connection to the woman who had shaped so much of his life. But as he stood in the quiet stillness of his cabin, a realization struck him. Evelyn Harper was meticulous. If she'd left behind photos, letters, and drawings for him to find, there might be more. Something hidden where no one else would think to look. His mind immediately returned to her attic. The house had felt like a time capsule, untouched by intruders or the passage of years. If Evelyn had anticipated someone coming after her belongings, she would have prepared accordingly. Perhaps the box wasn't the only clue she'd left behind. Returning to Evelyn's abandoned home under the cover of darkness, Daniel moved with purpose. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, but he barely noticed. His focus was razor sharp as he climbed the creaking stairs to the attic once again. This time, instead of sifting through boxes haphazardly, he examined every surface with painstaking care. It wasn't until he reached the small writing desk tucked into the corner that he found what he was looking for. At first glance, the desk appeared ordinary, a relic of another era. Its drawers empty save for a few stray paper clips and scraps of fabric. But when Daniel pressed firmly on the underside of the top drawer, it clicked, revealing a shallow compartment concealed within the false bottom. Inside lay a small digital voice recorder, its black casing dulled by dust. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with trembling hands, he pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, soft but steady, carrying the weight of decades of regret and resolve. If you're hearing this, Daniel, then I failed you again. Or perhaps I'm already gone. Either way, it's time you knew the truth. Not just about your mother, but about me. About why I stayed close to you all those years. Daniel sank onto the floor, clutching the recorder tightly as Evelyn's words washed over him. Your mother, Sarah, was braver than anyone I've ever known. She uncovered something terrible. A bribery scheme involving William Loring and a contractor named Victor Kane. They were funneling money meant for school improvements into their own pockets, using the town's resources to line their own coffers. When Sarah confronted them, they panicked. She threatened to expose them, to go public with what she'd discovered. A pause, heavy with emotion, before Evelyn continued. I don't know exactly how they silenced her. I wish I did. All I know is that she's disappeared shortly after, and the fire at the warehouse was staged to make it look like an accident. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. Fear kept me silent. Guilt kept me complicit. I couldn't save your mother, but I promised myself I wouldn't let them take you too. Tears blurred Daniel's vision as he listened, each word striking him like a hammer blow. Evelyn hadn't just been kind to him out of compassion. She'd taken him under her wing because she blamed herself for not acting sooner, for failing to protect his mother when it mattered most. You were such a bright, resilient boy, Evelyn went on, her voice cracking slightly. Even after everything, you carried yourself with dignity and strength. Watching you grow up reminded me of what I lost, and what I owed to Sarah. So I stayed close, hoping against hope that I could somehow make amends. Another long pause, followed by a shaky breath. Now, if you're listening to this, it means you've started asking questions. Be careful, Daniel. These men, they don't forget, and they don't forgive. If they think you're getting too close to the truth, they'll stop at nothing to silence you. But you deserve to know who you are, where you came from. You matter more than you know, not just to me, but to the world. The recording ended abruptly, leaving Daniel sitting in stunned silence. The weight of Evelyn's confession settled over him like a shroud, suffocating and yet strangely liberating. For 35 years he'd carried the burden of unanswered questions, of grief without closure. Now, finally, he understood. But understanding brought no peace. Instead, it ignited a fire within him, a fierce determination to confront the shadows that had haunted Elm Hollow for far too long. As he rose to his feet, slipping the recorder into his pocket, Daniel made a silent vow. He would honor Evelyn's memory and his mother's sacrifice by exposing the truth, no matter the cost. Jacob Loring and anyone else involved in the conspiracy would face justice. And if fear had kept Evelyn silent, Daniel would ensure that courage became her legacy. Stepping out into the cool night air, he glanced back at the crumbling house one last time. Though the structure was decaying, its secrets had given him clarity. Evelyn Harper had left him more than a box of mementos. She'd left him a mission. And Daniel Marks never backed down from a mission. The sun rose over Elm Hollow next morning, casting golden light across the town's weathered streets. For Daniel Marks, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for himself, but for the community that had long been shackled by secrets and silence. Armed with Evelyn Harper's voice recorder, Daniel drove straight to the sheriff's office. The local law enforcement hadn't exactly been a beacon of justice in decades past, but times had changed, and so had leadership. Sheriff Clara Hayes, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, greeted him with cautious curiosity. "Mr. Marks," she said, motioning for him to sit. "What brings you here?" "I have evidence related to a cold case," Daniel replied, placing the recorder on her desk. "My mother's disappearance, and possibly her death, are connected to corruption involving William Loring and others." Clara frowned, picking up the device. "This is quite a claim. Do you mind explaining further?" Daniel recounted everything he'd uncovered. Evelyn's confession, Jacob Loring's defensive behavior, the stolen box, and the decades-old conspiracy tied to his mother's fate. He played the recording for Clara, watching as her expression shifted from skepticism to shock. "This changes things," she admitted after a long pause. "If what Miss Harper says is true, we're dealing with more than just a missing persons case. This could implicate several high-profile individuals." "It does," Daniel agreed firmly. "And I want to make sure nothing gets swept under the rug this time. My family has waited 35 years for justice. So has this town." Clara nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll get my team started immediately. We'll need to secure search warrants, interview key players, and dig into old records. But Mr. Marks—" She hesitated, meeting his gaze. "You understand this won't be easy. People like the Lorings don't go down without a fight." "I'm counting on it," Daniel said evenly, "because neither do I." Over the following weeks, the investigation unfolded like a storm sweeping through Elm Hollow. armed with Evelyn's testimony and renewed public interest spurred by Daniel's involvement. Authorities began peeling back layers of deceit that had festered for decades. Documents were unearthed linking William Loring to fraudulent dealings with Victor Kane, the contractor mentioned in Evelyn's recording. Bank statements, forged contracts, and witness accounts painted a damning picture of greed and corruption. Jacob Loring became the first casualty of the probe. Though there wasn't enough evidence to charge him directly with his father's crimes, his role in tampering with evidence, including the theft of Evelyn's box, landed him behind bars. His arrest sent shockwaves through the town, shattering the illusion of respectability that had shielded him for years. For many residents of Elm Hollow, the revelations were both horrifying and cathartic. Old wounds reopened, but they also brought a sense of vindication. Conversations once whispered in shadows now took place openly at coffee shops and church gatherings. The town was finally confronting its demons, and healing because of it. In the midst of the chaos, Daniel turned his attention to something more constructive: rebuilding what had been lost. The crumbling elementary school where Evelyn had taught, and where his own life had been forever shaped, stood as a symbol of neglect and broken promises. Determined to honor Evelyn's legacy, Daniel announced plans to fund its restoration entirely out of pocket. At the groundbreaking ceremony, held on a crisp autumn morning, Daniel addressed a crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the historic moment. Standing before the skeletal remains of the old building, he spoke with quiet conviction. "This school represents hope," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling within him. "Hope for our children, for our future, and for redemption. It's fitting, then, that we dedicate it to someone who embodied those values: Evelyn Harper, a teacher, a protector, a beacon of light in the darkest of times." Applause rippled through the audience, accompanied by murmurs of gratitude and admiration. Many who had known Evelyn personally wiped away tears, moved by the tribute. Others simply nodded, acknowledging the debt owed to a woman who had sacrificed so much for their town. As construction crews began transforming the site into a state-of-the-art educational facility, Daniel made another announcement. He would establish a scholarship fund in Evelyn's name, ensuring that students from disadvantaged backgrounds would always have access to opportunities they might otherwise lack. Months later, when the newly christened Evelyn Harper Elementary School opened its doors, Daniel stood among cheering families, teachers, and community leaders. The building gleamed with fresh paint, modern classrooms, and a library stocked with books donated from across the country. Children laughed and ran through the halls, their energy infectious. For Daniel, the moment felt bittersweet. While justice had been served and Evelyn's memory honored, he couldn't help but think of all the years lost to lies and fear. Still, he found solace in knowing that the truth had prevailed, and that his actions had helped rewrite Elm Hollow's story. As he walked away from the celebration, heading toward his car, he glanced back one last time. In the distance, sunlight streamed through the school's windows, illuminating the plaque bearing Evelyn's name. Beneath it were the words she had once written to him: "You matter more than you know." And for the first time in decades, Daniel truly believed them. Months had passed since the reopening of Evelyn Harper's case, and Elm Hollow was beginning to heal. The town buzzed with renewed energy, its people united by a shared sense of justice and purpose. But for Daniel Marks, one question lingered unanswered. What had become of Evelyn Harper? He'd assumed she'd vanished permanently, perhaps even succumbed to the pressures that drove her into hiding decades ago. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the hope that somewhere, somehow, she might still be alive. It wasn't until a routine check by investigators turned up an unexpected lead, a woman matching Evelyn's description living under an alias in a nearby nursing home, that his suspicions were confirmed. The discovery came as both a shock and a gift. Evelyn had fled Elm Hollow not out of cowardice, but survival. Using a false identity, she'd sought refuge in a small care facility 2 counties over, where she lived quietly, tending to a modest garden filled with sunflowers. Her dementia had progressed slowly, stealing fragments of her memory but leaving behind glimpses of the compassionate teacher she'd once been. When Daniel arrived at the nursing home, his heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Would she recognize him? Would she remember the boy she'd cared for so deeply all those years ago? Or would she see only a stranger standing before her? The nurse who greeted him was kind, her demeanor gentle as she led him to Evelyn's room. "She doesn't always remember things clearly," the nurse explained softly, "but she loves visitors, especially when they bring flowers." Daniel nodded, clutching the single sunflower he'd brought with him. Its bright yellow petals seemed to glow against the sterile white walls of the hallway. As they approached Evelyn's door, he paused, taking a steadying breath before stepping inside. Evelyn sat by the window, gazing out at the small garden below. Her hair, once dark and neatly styled, was now streaked with silver and pulled back loosely. Lines etched her face, but her eyes, though clouded with age, still held a spark of warmth. She turned slightly as Daniel entered, her expression curious yet unguarded. "Hello, Miss Harper," Daniel said softly, stepping closer. "It's me, Daniel Marks." For a moment, she simply stared at him, her brow furrowing as though trying to place his face. Then, slowly, recognition flickered in her eyes, a faint glimmer of familiarity. "Daniel?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "Is that really you?" "It is," he replied, kneeling beside her chair. He held out the sunflower, watching as her gaze softened upon seeing it. "I thought you might like this. You always loved sunflowers, didn't you?" A faint smile touched her lips as she reached for the flower, her fingers brushing his. "They remind me of hope," she whispered, "of children believing in brighter days." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "You gave me hope, Evelyn. More than you'll ever know." Her eyes searched his face, clouded with confusion but brimming with gratitude. "I tried to protect you," she said haltingly, her words fragmented but sincere. "Your mother, she trusted me. I failed her, but I promised myself I wouldn't fail you too." "You didn't fail me," Daniel assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, in more ways than one. And now, thanks to you, the truth has come out. Justice is finally being served." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. She clutched the sunflower tightly, as if drawing strength from its presence. "You mattered, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "even when I doubted myself. I knew you mattered." Her words struck him like a wave, washing away years of doubt and uncertainty. For so long he'd questioned his worth, carrying the weight of his mother's absence and the secrets surrounding her fate. But here, in this quiet room with the woman who had shaped his life, he felt whole for the first time. "I came back, Evelyn," he said gently, placing a hand over hers. "Just like you always believed I would." She smiled faintly, her grip loosening on the flower as exhaustion settled over her features. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyelids drooping, "for coming back." As she drifted off to sleep, Daniel remained by her side, watching the sunlight dance across her face. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the breeze, sunflowers reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels of resilience and hope. Though Evelyn may have forgotten much of her past, her legacy endured. In the school named after her, in the lives she touched, and in the man who had returned to honor her sacrifice. And as Daniel rose to leave, he knew one thing for certain. Evelyn Harper's light would never fade, not as long as there were those willing to carry it forward.